So I think it's important for us to take a minute here and to think about things in terms of the historical context. And so the question that we need to ask then is, well, why did conflict theory develop? Functional theory came first, and if conflict theory came about as a response in some respects to the shortcomings of functional theory, what was it that was going on in society that encouraged conflict theory to form? And we need to really talk about that in terms of three major events that were going on at that moment in time: the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the French Revolution. Now, it's important to note that when we're talking about the development of social theory, we're talking about the West. And the West doesn't mean the Wild West like in the United States, but the West means primarily Western Europe 200 or 300 years ago, 400 years ago. And so when we're talking about the West, we're talking about an area of land that was close together regardless of any kind of country boundaries. And we're talking about a particular cultural, social, and economic way of life. So let's just take a quick look at that area that we're talking about. So at that particular moment in time, we would have been talking about Great Britain, Germany, France, a little farther south to Italy, Spain. We would have also probably perhaps been talking about Denmark. But when we talk about the West, this is the region of the world, particularly when we're talking from a historical perspective, that we're discussing. Now, it's important to note that in the contemporary world, the West means something different. Rather than being a physical geographic location, when we talk about the West or westernized cultures, now we talk about not only these countries, but the United States, Canada, Japan. And so when we talk about the West today, we're talking more about a concept than we are about a geographic region. All right, so I want to take a few minutes to talk about these three events: the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the French Revolution, and why these three events were so important with regard to the creation of the field of sociology, and in particular conflict theory. So let's talk about the Enlightenment first. This was a period of time of about 100 years, from the mid-1600s to about the mid-1700s, again occurring in the West. And it really was a cultural movement of intellectuals in that period of time. America was also considered to be part of the Age of Enlightenment, but the primary movement or the focus of the period of Enlightenment was in the West. And so what was going on in society? Well, you got to think back to what life might have been like if you were a part of that type of world. This was a feudal system, and so the rulers were kings, queens, and nobility. They were ordained by God. In other words, when a person was born into a noble family, there was a concentrated effort to make people believe that that was God's will that had that person born into that family. And there was a reason for that, because if you were in that family and grew up to be the king or the queen, no one could question your authority. To question the king or the queen then would be horrific. You wouldn't do it. It wasn't something that people thought to do. And so when the Enlightenment started to gain some steam, people started to really question, well, why would we just believe a person because they say they were born into that family by God's will? People started to really think about a different way to interpret their social reality. And that new way of thinking wasn't coming from the top. It was surely coming from the bottom, right? Because if you're at the top, you don't have to worry about your life. Everything is probably peachy keen for you. It's really the people at the bottom who started to push for a different way of viewing the world. We stopped seeing things in terms of superstition and mystery, and we started to think more along the lines of how could we deal with social reality. And that's an important thing to acknowledge that came out of the Enlightenment. We started to think about things in terms of what is real, what can we see, what can we measure. And so science begins to get a foothold, and we shift our way of thinking from a mystical sort of way of viewing life to a more concrete way of viewing life. This allows those philosophers back in the day to start thinking about why the social condition is as it is. They start to question whether or not things must be that way. They start to think about whether or not there's a different way to do things. And so that's the first sort of event that helps to trigger the beginning of sociology, and in particular the focus on conflict theory back in that time. And then right on the heels of the Enlightenment comes the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution was bloody, it was down and dirty, and it was very, very quick. And it came on the heels of a huge financial crisis in France. What was happening in the time? Well, the French society was undergoing that same sort of critical transformation that the Enlightenment began. And so people were thinking about these ideas about tradition and hierarchy and the monarchy and the aristocrats. And they were questioning whether or not they wanted to live in that type of system. And at this time, there were a couple of interesting things that went on, particularly in Paris, because Paris was the most populated urban center at that moment in time. And they had a couple of really bitter winters, horrible bitter winters. Now I want you to think about what this must have been like for people. People had largely, due to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which we'll get to next, people had largely abandoned their rural lives and flocked into these urban centers to live on the promise that life would be better for them. And then come these really horrible, bitter winters where the crops fail and people have nothing to eat. And of course now they don't live in a rural area where they can just go out to the garden and pick something to eat. They don't live in an area any longer where they can go out into the fields and hunt for food. And so imagine how you feel when you go just a few hours without a meal. These people were really realistically starving to death. And so that's one thing, right? You're pissed off because you're hungry, first of all. And you start to now question, as you see your leaders living this really high-style life, why things are the way they are, and you start to get really, really angry. So in the 10-year period of the French Revolution, it's estimated that nearly 40,000 people were killed, and it was a very, very dangerous place to be, to live. Things were upended. The government essentially disintegrated, and the revolutionaries tried to take control, and while they had control for a very short time, Napoleon Bonaparte came in at the end of 1799. But imagine being a social philosopher at that time and observing the events of the French Revolution and trying to understand what the tipping point was. What happened here that made these people band together, that pushed them over the edge and caused them to take action against the ruling party at that time. And so again, a foundation in conflict here. And so we can see here, as we will later understand through Marx's ideas, the notion of two parties who have separate interests and who at some point must have a revolution in order for society to become a better place. Now, hold that thought, because we will talk about that more later. I want to talk also now about the Industrial Revolution. Now remember, we're talking about the West, and it's important to note that we're talking about the West here because there are still many countries around the world that are in some state of industrialization. However, it's generally understood that the Industrial Revolution for the West was about 1750 to 1850. So it comes again on the heels of the Enlightenment. The French Revolution happens during it, and also the Industrial Revolution has played a role now, as we know, in the French Revolution. So changes in agriculture start to happen, manufacturing, mining, all of this stuff, technology, and everything that happens during the Industrial Revolution has a huge effect on the structure of society. It began in England and then it spread through Western Europe, which is what we're talking about now, and then eventually over to America, Canada, and on to Japan. So what was going on? All right, again, we've got to look back at how society was structured. The nobles and everyone else. It was basically a two-class system, the feudal system, where either you were a royal or part of a noble family and you had some power, or you were a peasant and you had no power. And you may even have been owned by someone else. And so you've got this two-class system, essentially, and then along comes this great invention called the steam engine. And the steam engine allows powered machinery. And so we start to see these urban centers spring up. And London was the first of those. Paris was also one of those. These urban centers were very few and far between. You had to walk probably many, many days to get to one. And so it wasn't like contemporary times. It wasn't as if you could roll out of your bed, take a hot shower, jump into your car, take a 15-minute drive to work on the way, stopping at Starbucks to get your coffee, and then turn around at the end of the day and come home to a hot meal. When you left to work in an urban center, a couple of things have to be noted here. One, it probably took you a few weeks to get there. Two, the trip was very, very dangerous. There were all kinds of people who were willing to take advantage of you on the highway or the road. Three, you probably weren't allowed to leave your rural land because you were probably working that land for some noble person. And so when you left, it's possible, probable in the early days of the revolution, that they tried to drag you back to make you work that land. Now at some point, the nobles finally realize this is just not going to work. We cannot continue to bring all of these people back in. And so the feudal system starts to crumble and we start to see the beginning of capitalism. And that's what the Industrial Revolution does for us. But it brings with it a whole host of social problems that we'd never seen before. Now we've got all these people who lived in all different regions of the country coming together in a very, very small space. We have a basic infrastructure set up to accommodate these people. So we've got some housing. We might have some sanitation, but it's not the greatest. We've got these people who are working in conditions that are crazy dangerous, sometimes 16, 17 hours a day, 7 days a week. Children were working alongside adults in these factories. We had extremely high child mortality rates in some of these urban centers because there were no laws to protect children who worked in factories. Rates of alcoholism were extremely high. Rates of STDs were extremely high. Many children were left to fend for themselves also during the day, and so you found that there wasn't a lot of schooling going on. A lot of these kids were considered to be quote-unquote street urchins who would run the streets all the time looking for opportunities or begging for food or begging for coins. So we had all of these people sort of shoved into this miserable existence, yet people thought it was great. And why would that be? Well, because now for the first time, they're out from under the thumb of the king, and they actually feel as if they have some control over their own destiny. Here they have an opportunity to make something for themselves. And then along comes the real essence of conflict theory in the work of Karl Marx. And so that's where we're going to leave this lecture, with these three events influencing not only the beginning of sociology, but more specifically observations which encourage the creation of conflict theory. I hope this helps. Take care.